Suzanne called me and asked me if I would do this. And I said, sure, I'd love to. Normally, judges
do the oath of office.
And she said, not this time. I said, okay, I'd be honored to do that. And I said, why are you asking me? And she said, you're the founding mother of the municipality of Anchorage as a member of the Charter Commission, and there are only 3 of you left, but you're the one I know. And secondly, you taught me how to run for public office, and I want you to do that. And I said, okay, I'm yours.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Anchorage Charter Commission member Jane Angvik, who, as you heard from the opening, administered the oath of office at the inauguration of Anchorage Mayor Suzanne LaFrance on July 1st. Jane has spent her life in service to Alaska, whether working for the Anchorage borough as a planner upon her arrival in 1973, working for the Alaska Federation of Natives, serving on the Anchorage Assembly, or training the next generation of leaders through Alaska Women Ascend. The ways that she has contributed to our state and city are many and profound. This episode will discuss much of Jane's life, including her childhood in Minnesota and her meeting of her husband, Vic Fischer, a founding father of Alaska who we sadly lost last year at the age of 99. This episode will, however, not include Jane's time on the Charter Commission. That period of her life, which so profoundly impacts what Anchorage is today, will be its own episode released next week.
Jane Angvik, welcome to the podcast.
I am delighted to be here.
Tell us about your childhood.
Oh, I had a great childhood.
And you were born in St. Paul?
St. Paul, Minnesota. I was born in 1948. Mom, whose name is Margaret, who is an Irish Catholic Democrat, or dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, and a Lutheran Norwegian Republican father. And he was a pretty dedicated Republican. And so they did have, quote, the mixed marriage. They
never shifted. He always voted Republican. She always voted Democrat.
Very simply, his worldview was shaped by the Depression. And she was 10 years younger than he was. So she didn't have that same. And so my dad's goal in life was to make, he was, first of all, never going to marry anybody. And secondly, he was never going to have children. And my mother seems to have changed his mind about all of that. But then his goal is to make enough money to make sure that everybody is okay. And financial security was number one. And so that was why he was a Republican, not because he was harsher or mean or selfish or anything. He just said, those are the people that will help me make money. My mother was an Irish Catholic, fun woman who liked to talk and dance and sing and play. Actually, she was the spark of his life, and they had a lot of fun together. And simple question is, I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a little Catholic enclave, went to a Catholic school from kindergarten through high school.
And you were raised Catholic. I mean,
I was
your mom
raised
was
Catholic.
In charge of the religion.
And my dad was okay with that. That was part of his deal, was, okay, fine.
And there were 5 kids.
Yeah.
And what number were you?
I am number 4, but I have an identical twin sister. So I have 2 older sisters. Then Judy and I were born, and then my brother is the 5th. So the only boy is the 5th child.
And were they trying for a boy?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it's fair to. So anyway, and the girls were athletes and could throw balls and kick footballs and run and chase. And Judy and I were very competitive swimmers who swam a lot. And I was a butterfly champion of Minnesota when I was 13 years old. And when you peak at 13, it's a long slide down. And yeah, it was fun. Our household was fun. And my mother came from a family of 7 siblings, and they all had 4 or 5 kids. And so I was part of this extended Irish family that met for Christmas and 4th of July every year. And we didn't live in the same town, but we lived in the same state. So everybody got together in one way or another. And
there were 50 first cousins.
I have 50 first cousins. At one point, there was 50
Right.
first cousins. And the women in particular, my mother's sisters, you married in, and then you were part of that clan. And
Right.
and those men who were all interesting and varied in their views of the world just said, yes, dear, and they would be part of it. And my dad had two sisters, and they were wonderful, and they were in our lives, but it was not like my mother's.
That is not like my family at all. And you said that you're going to the big family gathering soon.
Yes, August 3rd is the next family gathering, and I am going, and my daughter and her family are coming from Georgia to Minnesota to engage the cousins, which they like to do. And when I was going to marry Vic, I gave him an org chart of the family, and we had an hour from the time we landed in Minnesota to get to a state park where the family gathering was. And he memorized the entire org chart of who was who and whose kids were who, and my mother's sisters, and how many of their children and what their names are and stuff. And Vic was a smash hit because you walk in and there's a lot of people. And so somebody would say hello to him. And I'd say, this is my cousin Kathleen, and she is Harris and Margaret's daughter. To go, oh, you the twins, right? And they went, yes, sure. And he was a
The
great,
perfect politician.
he was working the room. There's
Right.
no question about it.
Happy childhood, big extended family. You went to college in Minnesota.
I spent 2 years at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, which is
Oh.
a Jesuit university. And then I transferred back to the University of Minnesota for the last 2 years. And I got a degree in urban studies from the University of Minnesota in 1970.
Because you wanted to be a planner?
I didn't know too much what I really wanted to do. And I remember talking to the counselor at school, and I switched my major 3 or 4 or 5 times. And I said, what I really want to do is be helpful with people. And I don't want to be a social worker, but I want to be able to help in some way. And I don't want to be an elementary school teacher, which some people suggested I do, and my twin sister did do. In our world at that time, you're supposed to be a nurse or a teacher or a secretary or something like that. And so I got a degree in urban studies, and I knew I got to be able to work when I was in college at the city planning office in Minneapolis as an intern. And I got to find out what they do and what a city plan looks like and how to do that. And so that part was fun. So I was inclined that way. And that's what I ended up doing.
I want to pause really fast because Judy decided to be an elementary school teacher. And I'm just curious if you can talk about growing up with an identical twin and how you guys felt about making completely different decisions, like what you're going to do with your life.
I loved being an identical twin, and we had a lot of fun. Only person who could tell us apart when we were small was my mother. And she had painted Judy's toenail red the minute she had a hold of us, and kept that red until we were 5 years old. So she would not ever mix up the babies. And there was no way to tell them apart when we were little. And then by the time we got started school, here's the best part about being a twin. I never had to start anything by myself. We were holding hands when we walked to school, and they said, now you're going to go to that room and you're going to go to that room. And we said, no, we come as a package. We're just going to stay together. And my mother said, it's my advice to the teachers that you let them stay together, because the hassle associated with them being mad at you is really not worth it. I don't know what that means. Anyway, it was really fun. I never had to go to summer camp alone. I never had to go to try out for a basketball team alone. And my mother said it's really weird that we would walk into a room, not say a word, and then simultaneously move as one. They both turned left and they were going over there, and they didn't even say a word. And she said it was spooky. So it was, from my perspective, it was fun. And we were very simpatico. When we were apart, I could feel her, and she could telepathically feel me. And so most kids, when they went away to college, were missing their parents, and I was missing Judy. And we went to different schools. And I would walk down the hall in the dormitory, stand in front of the payphone, and it would ring, and it would be Judy. And she had a payphone in her dorm, and she would go and stand by and she would know. We didn't say Tuesday afternoon at 5 o'clock. We just knew. And that link stayed with us our whole life. So it was pretty wonderful.
So you went to work for Minneapolis
Minneapolis City Plan. I went to work for the Minneapolis Model Cities program, and that was coordinated by the city. Model Cities was part of the Kennedy Johnson War on Poverty, and the main focus of the Model Cities program was maximum feasible citizen participation. That is printed in the wall, and what we're trying to do is assist communities that were generally economically depressed, which in Minneapolis meant they were either Black or American Indian, and that in those neighborhoods, we were trying to empower the people who lived in those neighborhoods to be able to get a voice, to be able to articulate what they needed and wanted. And they didn't need us to say, these guys need a better school. We needed to teach them how to say, I need a better school, and this is what a better school looks like. And so it was foundational in my view of the world in terms of what we can do to enhance the well-being of communities, specifically increasing access to how to work with government, but also how to work with the private sector. So it was both things. And if you come from a place where you don't know about that, then the capacity to be able to impart that information is really empowering to all concerned. So when they say, see you later, Jane, I don't need you anymore, that is success. That is success. And so how to influence the city council, how to influence the state legislature, how to influence Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, the largest producer of stuff in Minneapolis and the largest employer. And they have facilities right next to the ghetto. And can we work it out so that they are empowering the people who live there to be able to come and work at 3M? And what do we have to do that? So it was just a thrilling and exciting opportunity for a brand new out of school person who was just following everybody else around, learning how to do that. Then Richard Nixon was elected president of the United States, and then he declared that we had won that war on poverty and we don't have to have those model cities programs anymore. And I lost my job at the city of Minneapolis working with model cities. And at the time, which was 73, there were hundreds of people who were working in federal poverty programs, OEO programs, all kinds of efforts. And they all had master's degrees and 10 years of experience, and I had a BA and 2 years of experience. So I wasn't going to be very competitive in that environment with those kind of credentials for whatever else was going to show up next. So the first thing I did was go visit my twin sister, Judy, who was teaching school in the Philippines. So I went to the Philippines and played with her all over Southeast Asia for a month. And then on the way back, stopped to visit my sister Peggy, who was teaching school for the Anchorage School District. She was a junior high school English teacher, and she still likes junior high kids.
Where was she teaching?
She was in Eagle River and then subsequently at East and West High School.
Gotcha.
And she worked in the school district for 30 years, and she's always surprised when she's getting on an airplane and someone says, "Oh, Mrs. Ammon, how are you?" And she looks at it, and it's the pilot. And she goes, "I'm just fine." And he says, "I'm Timmy. You had me in the 8th grade." "Oh, okay, Timmy, I don't recognize you in this outfit as a pilot." Okay. So Peggy was living here, and I came to visit. And I hadn't been to Alaska before. And you had mountains and you had ocean. And we had spent a lot of time outdoors in Minnesota, but mountains were really attractive. And the fish at home are little and the fish here are big. And so I thought it was fabulous. And I applied for a job in Anchorage with the Greater Anchorage Area Borough Planning Department. And lo and behold, they said I could have that job. And so I went back to Minnesota and drove my car up to come and live in Anchorage, Alaska in the summer of 1973. And went to work for the Greater Anchorage Area Borough.
Jack Roderick?
Jack Roderick was the mayor. My first friend in Alaska was Susan Ruddy, who was working for Jack in the mayor's office. And she came down to the planning department because she'd heard that they'd hired a woman planner. And there I was, and we became friends forever. She's, in fact, the person who introduced me to Vic Fischer.
Tell us how you met Vic Fischer.
Susan and I at the borough had written a grant to the Alaska Humanities Forum. And what we wanted to do was create an opportunity for Anchorage to think more broadly about what kind of a future we want in the community. And my job was working on the comprehensive plan at the time. And one of the things from model cities that I had learned was we got to go out to neighborhoods and talk to people about what they think about. And so we have to hold community meetings. And I took Jack Roderick and I said, Jack, they have to see the mayor. They have to see the leader of the pack in order to believe that this is real. And so assembly meetings were on Tuesday nights. So on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday night, we had community meetings. And that is the way we did the fall and the winter of 73 and 74.
That's the basis for our community council system.
Yes, in fact, that was also the development of the community councils at the same time. So I got a job for the Greater Anchorage Area Borough, and then I met Susan Ruddy, and then the two of us wrote a grant to the Alaska Humanities Forum for the purposes of holding community think tanks. And only it wasn't going to be like meeting in the school cafeteria. We were going to get outside experts to come to Alaska and talk about different ways of doing things in governance. We held 4 of those over the course of the winter. One was a community group of smart people in California who had just developed something called the California Tomorrow Plan for the entire state of California, having to do with governance structures. We're not doing planning for the city. It was, how do we bring people together to make decisions when you've got counties and cities and neighborhoods in conflict? How do you do that in such a manner that you can do it with less conflict and seeking more cooperation? And so that group was particularly spectacular. And they would come into town on Thursday night, and we would have a reception for them. And then we would meet at the Hilton at noon, and we would start at 12:30 until 5. And there were 500 people who would come, and they didn't have to pay. Or they would come, and they would engage, and they would break into small groups, and they would come back with recommendations at the end of the day about what Anchorage could do with the same kinds of information. And it was thrilling and exciting. And Jack and the Planning and Zoning Commission and Assembly members would come, and they go, this is kind of interesting. These people in Anchorage don't like each other. And lo and behold, here they are talking cooperatively. That's a pretty good thing. And so we did that several times. And one time we did that, Vic knew Susan, and Vic was running the Institute of Social and Economic Research in Fairbanks. Some people called it the Institute of Everything. And the context of that is, at the time, there were no consulting companies in Anchorage. Or
in Alaska.
In Alaska. There were governments and there were private sector, but there wasn't any consulting companies. At the time, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was being planned. It was going to happen. They discovered oil, and they were going to plan it. So then the state of Alaska was facing issues of, we're broke today, but we're going to have money in the future. What do we do? So there was a lot of economists who were hired by us who were working on how do we manage the money problems of the state of Alaska and the money opportunities of Alaska in the manner that would be most important. They were also creating what are the economic structures of the private sector that can be enhanced by any intervention by anybody that would make it possible for us to accommodate the population that's coming. There's thousands of people that are going to come very quickly. And how do we get ready for it and stuff like that? So that's why they're doing all kinds of stuff. And then how do you manage the fishing game at the same time without hurting it and having more people and the demand? So they had many topics that they were addressing. But Vic came to Anchorage to come to one of the programs, and he knew Susan and asked if he could have coffee with the speaker. And she said, you could certainly have time for coffee before getting to the Hilton at noon. And that day, the speaker was missing at noon, at 12:30, at 1 o'clock. The main speaker was missing. And my job was to facilitate the
So
conversation.
you're like madly looking for the speaker.
We don't have a speaker. So Jack says, go call the police. I think they're at Peggy's Cafe, and tell the police to go pick them up and bring them here. And to go call the police meant get the quarter out of your pocket and put it into the payphone and call the police and say, the mayor just told me to tell you to go to Peggy's Cafe and get these guys for. And it was such a place at that time that a person on behalf of the mayor could go and talk about it. And so as the cops were getting ready to go get them at Peggy's Cafe, they walked on the door with the guy. And so Vic stuck around.
You were mad at him, right? I mean,
We were still sitting at lunch, and he was sitting in my chair. I was at the payphone. And he had sat down in my chair. And I didn't know him from Adam, but I was told that he's the person who walked away with the speaker. And so I was perturbed, and I was snarky, I would say. Rude, actually. And he was amused by my rudeness. Odd. Anyway, so what happened is he decided to stay and engage in the program. And when we were finished at 5 o'clock, and I facilitated the meeting the whole afternoon, and small groups would come back and report, and the conclusions of the day were X, Y, and Z, and we actually had a product. He said, that was pretty interesting. Good job, process-wise. And so he joined us afterwards for cocktails at the bar in the hotel, and he sat himself next to me because he wanted to know about me and how did I learn how to do that and with stuff like that. So he was pretty interesting. And the day had gone so well, I was no longer mad. So that was good. And he kept coming back to Anchorage to do meetings and stuff.
so after the Charter Commission, you were the campaign manager for Vic's run for Senate in 1980.
Yes.
And you learned he was no longer married by updating his bio and the campaign materials. That's just a crazy thing, too.
I said, what?
Do you remember that day?
Oh, yeah. That's what happened. I got a copy of his revised bio. It said he was divorced. I went, is this right? Is this what? So that's how I found out. And at the time, we were not
You weren't
together, but we had been. And we were married in 1981. I'd say it was the barrier. That was what happened. That is how I found out.
And you guys got married in 1981.
Mm-hmm.
And you had been elected to the Assembly. You were on the Assembly. He won his election. He was in the Senate. You guys were doing a late honeymoon to Africa. What was supposed to be your honeymoon and what happened?
We got married in 81, but we didn't go on a honeymoon until Christmas of 82 becoming 83. We were going to go to Africa to visit a friend of ours, Steve Reeve, and his family, who we had known forever. But Steve, had been a student of Vic's in Fairbanks and in planning, and had went off to live in Ketchikan and has been the community planner in Ketchikan forever. And then he went to work for USAID, and he was in Africa. He stood up for us in our wedding. And normally, the municipal budget was done by the end of December for sure, but usually the end of November. And fine, we did it. And it was a 6-5.
The budget was done. You told everybody you were going away for a month.
And it was 6-5 split assembly. So every vote counted. And the progressives had succeeded in setting the budget that we wanted. And I said, okay, I'm going. And then we were in Washington, D.C., taking care of stuff, and got a call that said, the mayor vetoed it. Can you come back and cast one more vote? And we're going to do it in 3 days. Can you come back? All right.
Because if you didn't come back, then they wouldn't be able to override. And
Right.
so you had to stop the mayor.
I flew back and voted. I paid for my own airplane ticket to come back to Anchorage to vote. And then after 2 days, I went back to Washington, D.C., and we went to visit some people in New York, and we were getting ready to get on the plane to go to Africa. And they called again and said, something else happened. And we need you to vote. And I said, I'm going to Africa. And they said, please come back. Please come back. And Vic said, honey, I'm going to Africa on the plane tickets that we have. And you can go home. It's okay. You can do that. But I think you got to figure out how to get to Africa from Alaska rather than coming back to the East Coast. And I'll meet you in Nairobi. I'll be in Nairobi.
So you came back and voted again.
I did.
And then flew to Africa by yourself.
It was dumb, but I did it.
And then when you were on the assembly, speaking of international travel, I think Rick Mystrom was assembly chair. And you were setting up Harbin as the sister city in China. And you went to China.
I was the vice chair. I was going to come in as the chair. And he said, do you and Vic want to come with Mary and me to meet these nice people in Harbin? And I hadn't ever been to China. I said, sure. Yes, I'd like to do that. And so we went to Harbin, China. And it was wonderful and terrific. And we met glorious people. That China was restricted, closed. So at the airport, they told us the 3 hotels, one of the 3 hotels we could stay in, and so we did. And everybody was wearing black or gray or navy blue Mao clothes. Everybody. Men.
Everyone was like wearing a uniform.
Yes. I mean, it was the beginnings of explorations of the Olympics. And so Rick was also working with people internationally about the potential of Anchorage to be a site for the Winter Olympics. He was engaged internationally in that as well.
And you served on the assembly from 80 to 86? Or
79 to 86.
79 to 86. And then you ran for lieutenant governor.
I ran for lieutenant governor in 86.
You were going to take it up to the next level. You ran for lieutenant governor. I guess tell us a little bit about the decision to do that and what that experience was like.
So at that time, Steve Cooper had been in the legislature and had managed the finance committee, and he was...
I do want to give some context for listeners, because Bill Sheffield had been governor from 82 to 86, but there had been impeachment proceedings.
Bill Sheffield had difficulties and was having challenges. And Stephen McAlpine was his lieutenant governor. And I was running as an independent, and the other person who was running for governor at the time was Steve Cooper. While we were not running as a team, we were
challenging the existing Democratic ticket.
Yes. And Bill Sheffield was perturbed, and Stephen McAlpine was furious that there were any pretenders to the throne other than them. And that he just said, the Republicans want this seat. Don't mess with us now. We do not want challenges in the primary. Wait your turn. You can do it next, but don't do this. And I just thought it's possible that you're both going to go down in flames and give it to the Republicans. So rather than have that be the outcome, why don't we see if we can be... We were not a team. It wasn't like Steve Cooper and I were saying this to Bill Sheffield and Stephen McAlpine. We were simply saying the Republicans were ready to go after him because Bill was weakened. And so what we just wanted to do is see if we could replace them in the general and see if that made a difference to the outcome.
The famous story about you campaigning for lieutenant governor was using your twin sister so that you could appear in parades in separate cities at the same time.
A little duplicity, I would say. It's always good to start your public life with a little duplicity.
Did she volunteer to do that? Did you ask her to do that? Or how did that happen?
She said, I'll do anything you want. And the first thing she did was dyed her blondie hair gray, so it looked more like me. And then we did look a lot alike. And I said, there are 6 parades on the 4th of July. Why don't you take 2 of them? And she said, okay, what do I do? And I said, you ride in the car and you smile and you wave. And she said, well, what do I do if somebody asks me a question? And I said, well, you ask them what their opinion is on that. And then you say, thank you. And that's it. And she said, well, what if they ask me what's my opinion? And I said, thank you. I'll have to think about that. But what happens is that sometimes people ask a question and you say, tell me what you think about it. And then you say, thank you. And they think you agreed with them. And what you said is thank you. And that way, you learn what they think, but you don't necessarily have to commit to it. And so all they really want to do is tell you.
Exactly.
Oh, this is what I want you to do.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah. Running statewide is really hard. And running statewide is a bigger challenge than I knew. And my day job had been working with Native communities all over the state. I had
So you
friends,
thought you knew how to do this?
I have friends in every region of the state. In fact, I won everything in the YK region. And Stephen said, how'd you do that? And I said, I've been hanging out in those villages for the last 10 years. They think I'm Native. All I can say is I lost the primary, and Steve Cooper won the primary, as did Stephen McAlpine. So they split those tickets. And so Bill Sheffield and I lost. And we have had many conversations, he and I, on why that happened. I was surprised, although I should have been smarter enough to know that could have happened. And Stephen had worked really hard and raised considerably more money than I had. But I was quite discouraged by all of that, and so was really saddened. And then, but the good news is we had a baby. Vic was running for re-election to the state senate. I was running for lieutenant governor. Our house was chaos, and we had a 2.5-year-old baby. And I did say to people, I didn't see how we could do this without somebody who's going to take care of the baby. Because normally campaigns from 5 until 7:30 or 8 is when people are having forums and community meetings and stuff like that. And so dinner is really the crux of when you're supposed to be there. And if we were both supposed to be someplace else at the same time, somebody had to take care of the baby. And my sister lived in Anchorage, but she also had 2 kids, and I didn't want to burden her. My sister, Peggy, when I would be on the assembly and Vic was in Juneau and I had Ruthie would go to her house on Tuesdays, and I'd drop her off at 3 o'clock to go to an assembly meeting that started at 4, and I would pick her up at midnight. Mm-hmm. And that's how we did that during those days. But my friend Kaylin is an early childhood education expert. That is her field of study. And she and I were friends, and she had helped me with Baby 101 business on how we do it, because Ruthie was adopted and she just fell out of the sky, and we caught her. And learning about it and how to do it, Vic had raised 3 kids. He actually knew how to do it. That was a very big help. And Kaylin Saxton said she would help, and she would pick up Ruthie. During the week, she picked up that baby every night at 5 o'clock, took her to our house, fed the baby, made sure she was comfortable, to give her a bath, put her to bed. And because Ruthie knew her, it was not hard for her. She would cuddle into Kaylin, and Kaylin would cuddle in, no problem, because they were buddies. It wasn't like a stranger. That was really an important thing. Really wonderful. Really a huge gift.
And sadly, you lost.
I lost.
Vic lost as well.
Yes.
And I think...
So I want to say one thing
Yeah,
about Vic.
say it.
Vic had been the first victim of big oil investing in an opponent in order to get rid of someone.
Mhm.
And Vic had
Rick Ewing.
I'm
running against him. Yeah.
right. But the reason Vic lost
It's because he stood up to oil.
exactly, and he was the first one who lost his seat as a result of that.
Interesting.
The first in the
Because
long
it's
run.
interesting because I wondered how that happened because
How could
Rick was a non-entity.
he wasn't interested
Right.
in the subject. He was also not a very good public speaker. He was shy. And so it was odd that Vic could be beaten by this guy who had enormous, wonderful budget to be able to work with television ads that were very effective.
They're available on YouTube. You can see the television ads against Vic still today.
Right.
So you are basically both unemployed afterwards. You got a job from the Alaska State Chamber of Commerce to manage the Alaska Pavilion at Expo 88 in Brisbane, Australia.
I'm having a no good, terrible day. I think I'll move to
You
Australia.
moved to Australia.
And we did.
And Ruthie went to kindergarten there.
Yes.
That's crazy.
And I actually, the sun and the moon and the stars really lined up. And for example, one of the issues at the time was that Congress was considering the 1991 amendments to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which would provide the Native corporations with the ability, the way the original act was written, all the corporations were supposed to automatically make their stock available for sale. And what the corporations wanted to do was make the decision about that themselves. And so the 1991 amendments would make the decision be a decision of the corporations as opposed to the automatic decision of ANCSA. And many Alaskans, business interests, wanted to buy that stock. And so they were very interested in making sure that it happened. And they were very opposed to the amendments. And I was out there on the stump telling people why they should support the 1990 amendments so that the local people get to make the decision about what happens to the ANCSA corporation stock. And big money was on the other side because they wanted to control the corporations. And that was a big variable in some people's decisions about contributing. But in Juneau, the guy who was the CEO of Sea Alaska, a white guy, had been at the Chamber of Commerce annual convention. And afterwards, he came up to me and he said, here's some money and I wish you well. But if after this you're not successful, Lieutenant Governor, come back and talk to me. And so he was on the board of the State Chamber of Commerce. So when this thing came up about Alaska going to the land down under, and I went and talked to him and said, I'd like to do that. I'd like to have the opportunity to represent Alaska in the South Pacific. And he made it happen. But then Cooper was the governor, and he felt bad about me losing anyway. And I said, can you help me do this? And he went, sure. What do we need to do? And he had people in the Department of Commerce who wanted to engage in this. And then we got the guy from Sea Alaska got the rest of the board to say, yes, let's go, let's do it. And that was how it happened.
And when you got back, you became the Commissioner of Commerce?
Yes. Yes. I am the queen of...
Yes.
What I did in Australia was sell Alaska to 20,000 people a day who came through the convention, and to a lot of business interests, a lot of money interested, a lot of oil and gas interests of people who were interested in, and, oh, by the way, the permanent fund was scheduled that year for the first time to consider international investments.
Oh.
And so every month we had a team of Alaskans who would come, and they would be the executives, and they would do a shift. And so it turned out that Dave Rose and Byron Millott were there at the same time as business executives, And the Australian stock market wanted to take them out to dinner and put them up in a resort for a weekend so that they could have a conversation with them about why they should invest in Australia. And they both said, okay, Jane, we'll do this, but you have to come with. And he said, oh, okay, I can handle that. And so it was very interesting to be present for the full court press of the Australian stock market. And then they didn't expect them to make a decision, but it was an interesting presentation. So that's fun.
And Cooper appointed you to Commissioner of Commerce after you got back from Australia.
But I was temporary because it was the end of the administration. I did it for 6 months.
Gotcha.
The commissioner had left, and he called me up and he said, you want the Commissioner of Commerce? I said, sure.
So you actually, 6 months, you weren't doing big policy, but I assume you did the job, so.
All of the bingo and pull tab stuff goes through Commerce. And the people who work in bingo and pull tab for the state of Alaska wanted the right to carry guns so that when they go and pick up their stuff in the bars, they were armed. I said, have you ever been to the Board of Trade in Nome? You ever been there at 7 o'clock at night? Well, what would be the advantage of having a gun in that place in case they didn't want to pay you for the pull tabs? Before you could get your gun out, 20 other people would have their guns and shooting at you. This is not a good idea. And he said, oh, we wouldn't do that tonight. So I said, okay, don't listen to me. We'll talk to the troopers. And they just said, no, we cannot take guns for bingo permits. This is a bad idea. So that was fun. Anyway, I also worked in DNR. And Commerce is easy compared to Health and Social Services.
Oh, yeah.
At one time, I was sitting there with a friend who was the Commissioner of Health and Social Services, and she said, you just got back from going to Hong Kong and Japan on a trade mission, and I just got killed by the legislature for trying to expand Medicaid. I think you've got the better job. And I went, you are right.
You helped found the Alaska Native Heritage Center.
Oh, yes, that was a real job.
Yes. And
I worked on that for 5 years.
yeah, it's beautiful. You did a great job. What did that entail? And what was that experience like?
Oh, it was just joyful. So there's a guy named Paul Tiolana. The lake at the Heritage Center is called Tiolana Lake. Paul Tiolana is from King Island, and his goal was to create something in Anchorage where people could learn about Native people and where Native people could sing and dance and make arts and sell them. And Paul came from Nome to Anchorage in the 60s and was a serious shareholder. So he was talking to Roy Hunter about this. And Roy asked me to come and sit in, and they were both excited about it. And he says, what we want to do is make this happen. And will you help us work on it? And I said yes. And so I worked at Siri for 5 years, planning it, hustling money, getting planning grants out of the federal government from both Interior through BIA stuff, as well as Commerce. And there's a Native Industrial Act that would provide funds, and we got grants from those organizations to help us plan and facilitate culture groups from each region who met for a year saying what was the most important thing about their Yupik or Athabascan or Fognak people, and sit down with people who would design things like that, and they would go back and forth, and it was so thrilling to dream it and make it happen. And then raising money was a big deal. And the other thing I had to do was get the site land use issue. And initially, we were going to be over there by where the botanical gardens are. And the people who, the community councils that I created had meetings, and they didn't want drunk natives anywhere around them. I said, this is going to be the biggest, wonderful asset to East Anchorage you've ever had. And And so they put it on the ballot and we lost.
It's terrible. I would love it to be there.
And so that was discouraging. And so then I went over to where we are, and then we had to negotiate with the U.S. Department of Education on releasing lands that had been set aside for educational purposes in Anchorage. And the lands had been set aside 30 years ago, and all we needed was 5 acres of it. And the school district was ready. They were happy. They thought this is an educational opportunity for them to have kids learn about stuff. And then the U.S. Department of Education was slow process. And we got it through, and it was approved, and we got the land, and we changed all the land use, the zoning and everything to accommodate it. And that was the last thing that happened the week before Vic and I left to go and live in Russia.
That's my next question. I wanted to talk about going to live in Moscow. You guys went to live in Moscow.
Yes.
Ruthie was 11 years old.
Yes. So that was 95.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I was apprehensive about it. And then a friend of mine said, let me get this straight. Your husband is offering you the opportunity to live in a foreign country for a year where you don't have to work. And what your job is to do is to learn about Russia and learn about the people and give that opportunity to your 11-year-old daughter. And your hesitation is what? Well, and she said, I've got cancer and I've got a 12-year-old child and I'm hoping that I can live until they gets out of high school. So you have an opportunity to spend time with your princess in a place where the both of you are going to learn everything. Go. I said, okay, I will. And that was great. And she changed my mind. And as a result, we got to go. And it was simply astonishing on so many levels. There were things that were hard. It was complicated because Vic was coming and going. So he would come back here and coordinate FUHA, and then he'd go back there. And
because you were working for Alaska in Moscow? Was he working for Alaska in Moscow?
He was doing Alaska-Russian stuff.
Gotcha.
And he could do it from here, he could do it from there. And he could do it from both places because what they were doing, it had been established in 88 to 89, and now it was 95. So the system was working really well, and Ted Stevens had completely underwritten Vic's program because it is the only person-to-person thing that was happening in the United States of America in creating pathways for Russians to be able to democratize and engage in trade and commerce as well as all the other stuff. And so Ted underwrote that a lot. So he could do that from here or there. And what he wanted to do was spend a little bit of time with his classmates before they all died.
Right.
And he did that. And he did. And
So you got to meet all of Vic's childhood friends.
A lot of them. What I really would do is they would be sitting at the dining room table talking, and 10 people could sit there and have dinner and talk for hours.
But you couldn't understand.
I learned. I would sit in the back and listen, and I learned. And I knew a lot of nouns. And what I was listening to was people talking about their fears predicated on 60 years of Soviet control. And so while he was talking about a new tomorrow, and it was the beginnings of perestroika, which was the Soviet Union had collapsed, and so they're trying, but the goods and services are just so scarce that nobody can believe in anything because there isn't enough food. There isn't enough.
There's no stability. There's no reliability.
You don't have jobs. You can't pay for the $8 electric bill. So it was listening to the fear of people who had been suppressed for decades, and then to say, what about your grandkids? This will be the same for them. What if it was different? Well, imagine what that would be like. Imagine what that could be. And he would be like a hope vendor. and And also he had the ability to give people money to do stuff that would make sure that their kids could go to school and stuff like that. And he did that a lot. It was, I'm going to say, it was holy. Meaning, if there was ever a good thing, it was Vic being there with people who eventually came to trust him and eventually came to believe that there was a different way. And there are people who have actually physically come here as a result of that, as was the case of many Russians at the time coming to Alaska. But it was also very personal for him, for Vic, because his parents had believed that communism was the way to fight fascism. And they believed it with their hearts and with their feet and with their beings, and were so discouraged by the oppression of Stalin. And what Vic thought he was doing was replicating their efforts in
A different
this time.
direction, yeah.
And he was motivated in an internal way that I hadn't seen before. He spoke about the Constitution that way, but he hadn't had a heart involvement in things as much as he did there.
So you said that when you were describing it to your friend about your reservations that you weren't going to work, that you did work there. You traveled around and you taught women in particular how to be a part of local government, how to run campaigns for local government. I mean, talk about how that got started and how you did that.
The Democratic Party and the Republican Party has an educational program of the United States of America that is in Russia and has been for as long as they could be, which was since the end of the Soviet Union. And they teach Government 101 to people and institutions and organizations. So I agreed to do that. I didn't get paid to do this, but I did do it. And it was really fun because the most difficult concept for people to wrap their brains around was, if you were the government because people had voted for you and you were the representatives and you had the opportunity to do good, that you would share that information with the people. And they would, what? I said, you have to tell them how much money you have and what we're going to spend the money on. He said, no, wow, what would be the point of being in the government if you can't keep that secret to yourself? And I said, no, but object of the game is open it up and make sure that people, and it was so hard because what I want to be is the guy in charge who can act like the other guys who have been in charge. No, I have to act like a new person in charge. Oh, that's way too hard. So it was really intriguing and interesting and fun and hopeful. Hopeful, really hopeful.
You ran for State House in 2000?
Yeah.
Who did you run against?
Les Garrett.
Oh.
At the beginning of time.
Wow.
I mean, 18 years he served. So this,
Yeah, his first one.
yeah. He won because he was more focused than I thought I was. I was riding on being famous, and
Right.
he was knocking on doors. Turns out knocking on doors is more useful.
We're getting towards the end of our time. Let's talk very briefly about yesterday. I watched you swear in the first elected female mayor of Anchorage.
It was really wonderful. I loved it. It was very exciting. I'll just say a quick piece is that on the day that Donald Trump took office, there was a women's march, and it was 20 below, and I was at the women's march, and they said, what do we need to do? And it was cold and awful, and they said, we need to elect more women. And so that's when Kay Brown and Suzanne Little and many others of us said, okay, that's it. That's our job. And we started Alaska Women Ascend, which is a program where we train progressive women how to run for public office. And Suzanne was one of our people who came early on and was part of the training program. In the audience yesterday was also Heather Flynn. And Heather Flynn had run for mayor and was defeated by Rick Meistrom, I believe. And there was a lot of talk about whether or not a woman could be in that job. Suzanne called me and asked me if I would do this. And I said, sure, I'd love to. Normally, judges
Do the oath of office.
And she said, not this time. I said, okay, I'd be honored to do that. And I said, why are you asking me? And she said, you're the founding mother of the municipality of Anchorage as a member of the Charter Commission, and there are only 3 of you left, but you're the one I know. And secondly, you taught me how to run for public office, and I want you to do that. And I said, okay, I'm yours. And so while we were doing it, and her mom was standing there, and and her husband, who was just a wonderful guy, were all there, and funny, her 3 teenage kids were bored, and I thought, oh man, there'll be a day when I think that's really important. From these days, the notion that a woman could do this was really clearly in my mind, and certainly one that should have occurred years ago. And I almost wanted to say from the podium, here's to Heather Flynn who broke trail for you. But the day is for Suzanne. Anyway, but I did write that note to Heather.
When you were on the assembly, there was a couple of other women, but Heather was by herself as the lone woman on the assembly for a few years.
And we had appointed Heather when I was still on, and then when I got off, it did shift around.
Jane Angvik, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was amazing. This is a great
I want to
time.
thank you, and I want to tell your listeners that I think the service that you provide in giving people insight about how things work from the inside out is really important, and that one of the messages that should come to them as a result of this is not only do we have rights as Americans as we come up on the 4th of July, but we have responsibilities. And that those responsibilities are to take the tool that is given to us, our right to vote and our right to assemble, and use those tools to influence the direction of our government, because it is simply a reflection of our values. So we have that opportunity to use those tools to enhance our communities. And if you don't use them, then you can't bitch.
Thank you so much.
Reminder that next week, Jane Angvik will be back as the guest again to discuss the Anchorage Charter Commission and the struggle to unify the municipality of Anchorage in 1975. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.